So India has seen a frightening rise in incidents of individualized hate violence, lynching, uh, targeting mostly uh, Muslims and to a smaller extent Dalits. Um, it is in many ways a new phenomenon, but I think I need to quickly caveat that saying that Dalits have been attacked, in fact, for generations, in what can be described as incidents of lynching. We must not describe them as such. Uh, Women, and actually we discovered during our journeys, uh, in the name of witch hunting, women have also suffered uh, attacks of lynching. Uh, but having said that, something new started unfolding over the last uh, 7, 8 years, uh, which was very dangerous, and I see very strong, very close parallels with the lynching of African Americans in the United States. In fact, the parallels are quite uncanny and very instructive. Um, but just to step back a little bit before I talk about lynching, people might say Hindus and Muslims. I mean, there's been what we call communal violence. They're mostly wrongly described as riots. We've seen very few riots really after partition. Partition were really riots. My own family was, actually displaced in very violent circumstances from what is now Pakistan, and at least a million people died, more or less equally between Hindus and Sikhs on one hand, and the Muslims in the other. Since then, we've had, almost, especially there was a period of relative peace between the communities, I think for about a decade and a half. And I believe that Mahatma Gandhi's assassination stunned the nation into this interlude of relative peace, and the leadership of Jawaharlal Nehru, our first Prime Minister. But towards the end of his tenure in 1961, we saw the first major post-partition incident of communal violence in Jabalpur, and it has continued, in different phases. I know that we're not talking about these periods of communal violence, but to place in context how I understand what is happening now, I'll speak for about 5 minutes on what I see as, in my analysis, there are about 3 phases in communal violence leading to this present phase of lynching, and I'll just try to explain that. The first phase was from 1961 to 1983. These were what were continuous incidents of communal violence with highly disproportionate damage to the Muslim people. Both in terms of life, property, sexual violence, and also death due to police firings. But there was also damage to some degree to the Hindu community. I mean, there were acts of, there were to some extent riots, but they were largely pogroms. There were riots tending towards pogroms in a sense. 1983 saw the first, massive communal massacre in a place called Nelly in Assam. And these were straightforward, one-sided massacres. And the major ones were 1983 in Nelly, 1984 against the Sikhs in Delhi, 1989 when the movement for the demolition of the Babri Masjid was picking up. Bhagalpur saw very massive episode of criminal violence. About 2,000 people were killed. Bombay went on after the demolition of the Babri Masjid to see large violence, and it sort of climaxed in a sense in Gujarat in 2002. Now, what characterized this phase was, casualties in about 4 figures, and almost entirely one-sided of the minority community. And there were pogroms of a very straightforward nature. Then 2002, post 2002, I mean, I, for instance, in my own personal journey, was so horrified and at what happened, the brutality of what happened, and I chose to leave my position in the civil service because I saw the direction in which the country was moving, and sadly, I was, far too accurate in that understanding. But not just me. I think many people saw that as a turning point. That if we don't intervene now, we lose everything that is precious about the idea of India itself. And so I think what changed in 2002, we were not able to bring Mr. Modi and his senior colleagues, by and large, to final punishment is a wrong word, to conviction, but they, for the first time, they were at least held to account. The United States refused a visa to Mr. Modi right up to the time he got elected as Prime Minister. Many European countries did it, and Mr. Modi was made to appear before a special investigation, committee, and so on and so forth. So it just made it very clear, I think, to them that it is too costly. It's politically too costly to have these large, dramatic massacres. And I see a very, very sharp change after that. And so we've had communal massacres after that, but the casualties reduced to 2 figures, less than 100 people. So we had the anti-Christian violence in Kandhamal in 2006-07. In 2012, we had the attacks in parts of Assam. 2013, importantly, we had the Muzaffarnagar criminal violence. Now, in these, as I said, the figures of casualties was much smaller, so the world didn't pay attention in the way that they did to the large massacres. But the damage was huge in terms of breaking down of relationships between the two communities. And I observed very closely, and I worked with all of these, that they ensured a bitterness and a sort of almost finality to the rupture between the two communities. So the degree of displacement was huge. Muzaffarnagar, in just a few villages, but every single Muslim suddenly was no longer welcome. They were, had to rebuild in terrible circumstances, etc. That was a recurring story, and I see that as the third phase. And I see lynching actually as a fourth phase, where you bring down the casualties to 1 digit. And in some ways, you have the largest impact, in terms of their political objectives of fostering hatred and division. I was reading, I've been trying to read quite a lot about the African American lynchings, and there was a historian, her name is slipping my mind, but she wrote something very eloquently. She said that every lynching was 1,000 lynchings that reverberated across the mountains, the rivers, the deserts, and settled finally as fear in the heart of every African American. And therefore, when the lynchings happened, you had 1 million people, migrating and so on and so forth. The actual number of lynchings was actually pretty small. In 1918, I think, uh, was when the first uh, bill was moved for an anti-lynching law in the United States. It took exactly 100 years for the law to be passed. And the preamble of that law actually talks about 60 years of lynching. And I was struck by the fact that they mentioned a figure of only about 4,500 lynchings. So actually a single communal massacre in India took about that, that many lives. And we were talking. And so many people talk about, but how many people died? And it's hard in India because we're not, for many reasons that I'll explain. But assume that 100 people, 200 people were killed in lynching incidents. People will say, but that's nothing, compared to even a single episode of communal violence in the past. But that's, in India, I would say that every lynching was 10,000 lynchings that reverberated across the land, the rivers, the deserts, and so on, and settled in the heart of every Muslim as fear and inform them about what their status in this country had become. And there are many examples. A young 14-year-old boy called Junaid was lynched, because he was visibly Muslim in a train close to Delhi. And so many of my young Muslim colleagues say that after that, their mother, tells them when they go on a train, be very careful. If I call you on the phone, don't say salam alaikum. And we have a culture where people sort of congregate and chat and have political discussions. Don't involve yourself in any political discussion. Don't let anyone know that you're Muslim, etc., etc. So that's what I meant. It one Junaid's lynching, and it spread across the country. The other, very important comparison with the African American lynchings is the performative character of this violence. Uh, they had such an impact because there used to be large public events, as you of course know, and families used to gather. In fact, children used to gather. It was like a picnic, and they saw this black man, being beaten up, his body parts being cut, and even sold as souvenirs apparently, and he was finally hung. I still wonder what would be the psychological impact on the people who observed this violence. But the parallels with what happens in India is the replacement of these large gatherings with the video camera. And what is common to almost every incident of lynching that I saw was that these would be videotaped gleefully and diligently by the perpetrators of the violence, who would not hesitate actually to have their faces on the videos. And these would circulate very widely, and almost in real time sometimes. I know one case when I'd gone to Jharkhand, where in the horror that this man was being lynched, and they were circulated the video while he was being lynched, and his son actually saw the video, and he saw his father actually being lynched in real time. And of course, he desperately tried to reach and couldn't reach, and he was 16 years old. And anyway, so that is the other character that draws very strongly parallels. I've also done one kind of academic article trying to make this argument as well. Now, when this started unfolding, we some data. There's very little actual, no official data about lynching. It's not recognized. So we had a few civil society attempts with news portals. So Hindustan Times started one, and we were closely associated. And then not only was it pulled off at the intervention at the highest level, but he was the editor-in-chief was sacked. Actually. And then another news portal called India Spend started a hate crime watch. Again, we were part of it. and they came under pressure and they put it off. And now we are trying to revive it with another partner. But the data, India Spain did a very quick survey of cases of lynching reported in the English language press. I mean, there could be no doubt about. And the figures that they have, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I might be wrong by 1 or 2 digits, but 86%, I think, of people killed in cases of lynching occurred, targeted Muslims and killed Muslims. 8% were Dalits, and the remaining 6%, some of them were identity unknown. So actually, it may be even higher. So that was there. And the other, and this figure I can just check, but about 94 or more percent of incidents of lynching since 2010 had happened after Mr. Modi came to power. And that too was very significant. It is not my case that Mr. Modi and his Home Minister Amit Shah sit down and say now we'll have a lynching here or a lynching there, but they created an environment which valorized hatred and bigotry and violence, and that message was very clear. When somebody also videotapes themselves themselves committing a crime for which in Indian law you can actually be hung from the gallows. You do it with the entire confidence that far from being criminalized, you'll be a hero of the Hindu nation, and you'll go far. And that message is has clearly gone from the top. I was more and more devastated with each incident of lynching. And in the first few, I went personally, met the families, and I realized how desperately alone they had become, and that the police, in almost every case, actually makes the victim the accused. Because if you've been lynched in the name of cow slaughter, you actually committed the crime. And the crowd was only just sort of naturally sort of provoked by your crime. So that is how most cases were treated. And so I made a call. Actually, it was just suddenly something in my heart spoke out, and I said that I write a column in the Indian Express, and I wrote saying that I want to do a journey which we called Karwan-e Mohabbat, or Caravan of Love. And we will go to every home where people have been lynched, not as fact finders, not as reporters, not as human rights workers, but like you would go to a family member or a dear friend, in that spirit, to share their pain. And I was surprised. I mean, I just made the call and I said, I want to start next month. And so many people reached out. And there were filmmakers, writers, human rights workers, young students. So initially I planned a journey of a month, and we started in a place called Nagaon in Assam, and we ended a month later, on 2nd October, at the birthplace of Mahatma Gandhi in Porbandar, on the west. But this journey was so overwhelming that I realized and resolved that we will not stop the Karwa. And so we resolved that we would travel every single month, at least once, mostly on our own expense. I would put out a call, and people would drop what they are doing and would join the journey. And we made about 30 journeys to 14 states. And this continued until the Delhi riots and the lockdown. everything, of course, came into a pause mode, but we do want to and will restart when it's possible to travel again. A few things about what we observed, three or four things, and I think that that would summarize. The first was the enormous cruelty of the killings. It was not simply killing. I mean, we had the families so often told us uh, in Hindi के काश वो बस गोली मार देते, छुरा मार देते, ऐसा torture करके क्यों मारा? Why? I wish they just shot him. I wish they just knifed him to death. I mean, why did they torture him so much? And there was so much wanton cruelty. They would have gouged out their eyes. They would smash their genitals. We had went to a place where they cut off his penis actually, and that is how the body was received by his wife. They burn you. They would do all sorts of really cruel things, and they would also kill you slowly, and because the crowd would gather and would beat you and beat you and beat you till you die over, sometimes over hours. And so the first thing that struck us from these journeys was how extreme and wanton was this cruelty. The second was, of course, what I've already spoken about, the performative character. Always would they would videotape and gleefully circulate, and the very wide consumption of those videos, by people who would receive them. The third thing that was the role of the police, where sometimes they were actually standing there and watching, encouraging. And sometimes they would come later, but they would do nothing to protect, but instead they would criminalize and there were many examples of this. I mean, just to illustrate two or three, I mean, one of the famous cases was a dairy farmer called Pehlu Khan, and he was traveling on a truck with dairy cows, very expensive dairy cows and calves, which he had bought. Now, if you were going to sell that animal for slaughter, it would not have cost more than 5,000 rupees. You have spent something like 50,000 rupees on the cow. You'll have to be crazy in your head if you bought a cow for 50,000 only to slaughter it and sell it. So obviously, actually, as soon as the crowd caught him, there was no question that he was taking the animal for slaughter. Yet they lynched him very cruelly to death. They filmed it, but what I found was that the police, even the Home Minister, the BJP Home Minister of the state, they all announced that he was a dreaded smuggler and he was, taking the animal for slaughter, which was so obviously false. Incidentally, some months later during our Karwan, we were traveling past that place. And so I made a sort of actually a casual announcement that at the place on the highway side where he was lynched, I want to stop and place a few flowers. And it led to such an uproar because the people said that we will not allow this to happen. And come what may, we will not allow it to happen. And then I said, in that case, there's no way we will not go there and place the flowers. So the district officers, the senior officers, they all, I was also a civil servant, so they appealed to me in many different ways. And I said, how and why are you stopping me? And I will go. The next morning when the bus reached there, a huge crowd had gathered with stones and sticks. And so I told my colleagues that now I'm not going to risk any of your lives. I'm otherwise not the leader of this, but at this moment I'll take leadership. I alone will get off, and I will place the flowers. You will all stay inside the vehicle. So the superintendent of police, etc., came and discussed. And I talked to them and I said that, how have you registered criminal cases against him? And where's your conscience? Where's your sense of policing, etc.? Anyway, so then I started moving, and they said, no, no, but look at the crowds, and what can we do? So I said, I've been in the administration. A crowd of 200 people could not have gathered unless you allowed them to, and I understand what's happening. But I am going to go. They said that no, this blocked my path. I said, you're doing something illegal. You can either arrest me, or you have to let me go. And they said, no, we have instruction that we can't arrest you. So I sort of spontaneously sat down on the ground and said, I'm starting a dharna and a fast, and I won't move till I'm allowed to place the flowers. And it was really strange. I mean, I had 6 marigolds in my hand, and all of those, and at some point the officer started arguing with me and saying, after all, in a democracy, they have the right to present their disagreement. I said, yes, if they have the right to present their disagreement with stones and sticks, I have the right to present my disagreement with these 6 marigold flowers. And so after a long time, they realized that I was not going to let go. So I walked, but the 200 people surrounded me, the cops, and I walked there. And then, of course, I was in a bit of a, because I don't pray and I didn't know what I should do at that point. And so I just placed the flowers, and then I said that I do this in memory of Pehlu Khan and all people who've been lynched and so on. But the degree, and when our bus moved, they started stoning the bus and so on. And there was so much rage and anger, and the role of the police very brazenly in all of these matters. Just one other case which just illustrates what kind of, and this is again quite close to Delhi. There was a man a very poor Muslim man who made his living by buying kid goats and then fattening them up in his one-room house and finally selling them. And he earned very little. Suddenly, in his village, a place called Hapur, they announced that he had slaughtered a cow. And he surrounded by people in the village. And the sad thing is that, I mean, I've seen pictures, because all of that was videotaped, that a large number of them were young people, even children. And they had gathered, in response to this call that came from the temple that he had slaughtered a cow. And they came with anything that could attack. So they came with screwdrivers, they came with, with knives, with pens, pens as weapons in other ways one has heard. And the family told us when we met them later that there wasn't a part of his body that hadn't been pierced, And where is this much of cruelty with children, and they would videotape. And then this went on for hours, and he kept, and then finally you almost become unconscious. And I found in a number of these, a lot of blood is to ask for water. And the triumph is that they won't give you water. And that's what he did. He said, give me some water, give me some water. And then he finally fainted, became unconscious. The next thing that happened, actually, the police came and they tied him up like you tie up an animal. And they dragged him on the ground. And they would pick their pictures of him being dragged on the ground. And perhaps he was still alive, I don't know. And he died by the time, they picked him up in that way. So the role of the police was the third thing that I have found. And the last is the role of the Hindu community. I mean, in every instance, and now we've made so many journeys, I think I must have met over 100, 150 families in far corners of the country. The I almost would beg them, somebody must have come and helped you. One person should have at least come and helped you. And the answer was always no one, no one. And that is what made me sort of slip almost into despair. I've handled large communal riots. Even I worked for many years in Gujarat. What I enabled me to still live through all of this was that I discovered that in Gujarat, I can even do it as a challenge. Of every story of cruelty and violence, I can find you three of kindness and courage of people who saved lives. And there are a number of really beautiful stories that I encountered. Actually, people don't even tell them, and you have to ask. And then people say, of course, that's how, and so on. But that didn't happen in the lynchings. And I think that it showed that we had reached a level of uncompromising hate of this kind. So then in these circumstances, when we would go to the families, there were four things that we would say. I would be speaking to them. And firstly, that we want you to know that you're not alone, that there are many people who share your pain. And we would weep, and so on. The second was that we seek forgiveness for what we have become as a country. In a sense, we are also culpable. And the third, to fight for justice, we will not leave you. We will always be there. And the fourth, very importantly, and this again something I've learned over the years, there needs an acknowledgement. We will tell your story. And I realized this, very strongly then, and that's why some filmmakers, writers had also joined, and we brought out one book. We made a number of films, and the importance of that. I mean, in the United States, they opened recently a few years ago this museum and I normally don't, but I actually made a special journey when I was in the US to see it, and it was just very moving because in the lynching section, in many they don't even have a picture of the person. They don't know anything about what he looked like, etc. And they would commemorate with actually a bottle of sand, which they gathered from under the tree where the lynching took place, put his name there, and whatever pieces of the story they could get. And I saw many people, especially African American people, young people, children, actually just sitting, watching, and weeping. And the importance of that acknowledgement was also important. So that is what we set out and continue to do with our caravan. So yeah, that's the story.
Thank you, Arsh. Indeed, we are here for acknowledging, and we are really very grateful to you for all this work and the way you are testifying, offering your testimony of what has happened. I have few questions, but Shirin, please go ahead with yours. We will enter now a conversation on a conversation mode.
Yeah.
Thanks. Firstly, I mean, it's absolutely harrowing, but also just so important, this testimony. So thank you so much. So I wanted to ask you a question, two questions. First was this linking between the African Americans and what's happening in the country today in India. And I was thinking when you were speaking about the kind of, there's this phrase about the ripples of harm, when you said each death is actually 1,000 deaths. And also how the performative character of this is so important. And I think the two things are linked also in the sense of how that sort of, the ripples of harm sort of consume. But I wanted to ask you, did you talk to the Hindu community? Because this thing, my father and my mother also came during the partition from, from Multan and from Lahore. And you're absolutely right. They also told stories of how they were helped. But is this the performative nature of the way this is being done and the kind of culture or environment of impunity that is being created, which you also referred to, that is leading to, were you able to talk to Hindu families to ask them why did they not help?
Why did they do this? We did it in a few places,
Right.
but it was okay. Let me give you one story where we managed to do it. It was one of the rarer ones. There was a horrible incident. It was the 25th anniversary of the Babri Masjid demolition, exactly that date. And one person somewhere decided that I will kill a Muslim performatively on video to take revenge and to mark this day. Now, this was in a place called Rajsaman, close to Udaipur. What did he do? Bengali migrants come from Bengal and do construction work there, and they've been doing it for years. And most of them are Muslim. He got the number of one person called Afrazul, and he asked him that I have this plot somewhere, and you come in and help me with the construction. He needed somebody to videotape it. So he trained his nephew, who was 13, 14 years old, to hold the camera when he licks this person to death. The two of them went there. Afrazul, of course, innocently came in. And within about 15 seconds, that's all on the camera, this man started bludgeoning him. And his last words were, Babuji, why are you doing this? What have I done? And so he lynches him to death. What is terrifying is how steady the boy's hand is. I mean, it's like he's on a tripod. He doesn't tremble. This man is bludgeoned to death. Then he sprinkles petrol on him and sets him on fire. And then he turns to the camera and he gives this long tirade about how terrible Muslims are. And he talks about many things, all the usual prejudices that people have. One thing he talked a lot about was love jihad. He didn't claim that Afrazul was involved in love jihad, but he said Muslims take away Hindu women and so on and so forth. Now, we reached a day or two later, and it was horrible because the police doesn't even cordon off because they don't want the evidence. And dogs were actually pecking at the place where the violence happened, and we were just so saddened. And then we collected wildflowers, we put it there, etc. Then at that time we said, because he'd gone on video, and he then did 2 or 3 sort of thing, and then the police, of course, had to pick him up. So we decided to go to his family home and speak to them. When we went, many things happened. I mean, his 2 brothers would live with him, and so. And this man's own child was mentally challenged, and a really lovely little kid, because she didn't know what was happening, so she came and she hugged us all and touched our feet and so on and so forth. So that was one, and he was actually holding her when in one of the subsequent videos, and of course the family was appalled at what he'd done because he destroyed the life of that child. But that he was justified in what he did is what they maintained. And we said, why? And they said, they do too much of this love jihad and these Muslims and so on. And also importantly, the community was the Raigar community, they were Dalits. And even among the Dalits, a pretty disadvantaged caste of the Dalits. And so on. So, and we also learned that about the young man, they said that he had set up some kind of a business, but because of demonetization, it collapsed, and he was just sitting at home and used to keep watching these videos of the Bajrang Dal and all the hate videos all the time. Of course, his anger should have been directed at the person who caused his ruin, but obviously it didn't. Instead, it got directed on Muslims, and he. Now just to understand, I said, okay, tell me which cases of love jihad have happened. Then they were stumped, and they could recall just 3 cases of Hindu-Muslim alliances, Muslim men and Hindu women. One was 11 years ago, one was some 9 years ago, and one was about 2-3 years ago. That was all. And we then tried to meet these people, and they were obviously consensual relationships. So, so I think that it was instructive to us and to me. Again, I wrote about it, at how deep this hatred has permeated, where even an act of this immense cruelty and completely mindless, you don't know the person, you have nothing to do with it. I then, in one of the Karma journeys, we went to Bengal to actually to the village of Afrazul, and each one of these journeys have been just so painful. And his wife was telling us that he did all of this so that he wanted his daughter to be educated, and she was in class 12. And he said at 9 every morning with the mobile phone, he would ring up. And she said we'd have the same conversation. How's everything? Has she gone to school? What did you cook? Etc. etc. And that morning also they'd had the same conversation. And then he just disappeared like this, And yeah, I think there were few occasions where we tried to talk to the Hindu community, and it just I think saddened me so much. But in a more general sense, by writing and by speaking and so on, we would try. I mean, in the same case, about a month later, we made a request to the Hindu community in Rajsamand to have a meeting to discuss this incident. And some people gathered, and I remember speaking to them saying that, this is what happened. And, I can, okay, let us accept that you don't care about the Muslim, you don't care about Afrazul, you don't care about his family. Don't you care about your own children? Do you want them to be raised in the way that this boy was raised, who could unflinchingly film this kind of killing, lynching? And I don't think they were persuaded.
Yeah. Oh, anyways, it is, I think, just the power of today's hate culture. Christoph.
Yeah, I would like to return to the perpetrators of violence, Arsh, because on one hand, we see individuals in the last event, incident, death. You tell us about it's an individual decision that is made. On the other hand, we do know that vigilante groups played a very important role. And I would like to reconcile these two, because can we look at this wave of lynchings, because it's less now, as something that has been orchestrated, and we have seen campaigns. We have seen campaigns against conversion. That was the famous
and love jihad, basically, yes.
Exactly, the campaign against love jihad. There were also campaigns against land jihad, and now in between this campaign of cow protection. And the Gao Rakshak Dal was an organization. So there was a form of orchestration of all this. So can we consider that the perpetrators have been trained or galvanized or part of a larger movement which is well oiled in many ways?
So this case that I described, he was certainly a Lone Ranger kind of guy who had been highly radicalized by the videos that he saw.
Okay.
But he clearly did it on his own, just he and his nephew, no. But almost every other case certainly indicates a high degree of organization, and they're always done also in before an election. There's also always a political purpose to most of the lynchings. About training, this is something I want to know more about. Uh, in, in one of our journeys, I remember that this guy came, and it was in a village, and I was quite struck because he said, "Let me show you." And he took a mobile phone and he gave all kinds of commands that mystified me. And he was able to enter into Bajrang Dal videos, and they were terrifying. But they were telling you exactly how to kill without leaving evidence, etc., etc. And so they were clearly how-to videos about killing. So that is there, but I think most of this propaganda about cow slaughter, love jihad, etc., has been very systematically created. I do want to still add, though, a lot of people blame that this is all being caused by social media and the freedom of this kind of communication. I think that's a sort of it's a somewhat simplistic idea, because the RSS and its organizations have actually specialized in the spreading of rumors long before there was any kind of social media. And you read about the partition riots, the riots that I've handled as a civil servant. I'm just amazed, and then investigated a lot. I'm just to give one illustration. Bhagalpur riots, where an estimated 2,000 people were killed, started on the basis of a rumor that Hindu children, students in Bhagalpur town living in hostels and PG, etc., have been slaughtered whole scale. As it happened, not a single child had been touched. But how this rumor spread in the matter of a day or so across, and this was long before we had any kind of communication, phones were difficult, etc. And as a result of, as a response to that, the slaughter of Muslims happened, village after village after village. So, I mean, we don't have the time, but I can tell you many stories about how I saw this is really something that they've practiced at, how they spread, So you'll always hear in any riot, Muslims have come armed, in Hindi they say hatyaron se lace hoke, gaadiyan bhar ke, they're going here, they're going there. I've heard this repeated. Never has it actually happened. But this sort of, so I think social media has given a vehicle for this propagation, but it is central to how you foster hate.
Yeah. And one more thing for me on my side, one more question that came to my mind is, of course, the police is criminalized. What about the judiciary? What has the judiciary done? Do we see any trial, intervention, whatever? Nothing.
Very, very rare. I mean, we've gone, repeatedly, because my colleagues are pursuing a number of cases on the ground. And, for instance, the Pehlu Khan case, it was horrible that they got acquitted, and people were raising slogans, Jai Shri Ram, etc., inside the court. The courts are, especially the low courts, are quite openly sites of, Hindu Rashtra playing out. We've seen this over and over again. There is the rare, judge of courage and integrity and compassion, but they don't make the rule at all. We had a couple of cases. I mean, interestingly, uh, the story I was telling you in Jharkhand, where this boy saw his father being lynched and he was killed. His mother is a very, very strong woman and determined, and with support she fought the case, and we got the first conviction in the country in a lynching case, and 8 people were arrested. Within weeks they got bail, which is unusual after conviction in a case of murder. And that was a case where people were, milling around outside to grab them as celebrities. And one group got them, took them as celebrities, and took them to a union minister's home, where he was waiting for them with garlands and so on and so forth. So, so there are. I mean, that was one instance. There was another instance again, which was again very courageous instance. This is a place called Latehar. I'll tell you one more story. I think the stories will churn your stomach. But in this village, there was a woman who didn't have any brothers. Her parents, you need a man to look after them. They'd become old, so they brought in what is called a ghar jamai, a man who agrees to live with the woman's family, and he was their main bread earner. And there was another partner that he had, and together they used to buy and sell cows, not for slaughter, but the Bajangal people came and threatened them and said that we'll kill you if you continue this. They said, we have this one last set, and just let us sell them, and we promise to give up this trade altogether. They agreed, but when they set out, they assaulted them. They killed this young man and hung him by a tree, very much like the lynching one. But the other part of the story, the partner actually had got injured. So he asked his 12-year-old son to come out of school and help him. And so the second person to be lynched was the 12-year-old boy. And he was killed, and he was also hung. When we went, the boy's father, I think, wanted to share, and when you pray, there's an atmosphere. He said something that absolutely broke my heart, a bit like Sophie's choice. He said, I was present when my son was lynched and hung, but I didn't go forward to save him, because they would have then lynched me, and what would have happened to my other children? And this was so what these incidents do. And so you have this, I mean, one of those forever pictures of this young kid hung from a tree along with this older man, and the wife of this man, she was so brave. I mean, she was telling us that even the Muslim community had completely abandoned them because they were too scared. She was completely alone. She had nothing to feed her children, but she was determined that she would get justice, and she had to walk to the court through the village where the lynching happened. And she walked several times, went to the court, gave testimony, and got the second conviction. So it's not impossible, but it requires judges of character and the survivors of who are able to take on this courageous stand.
Yeah, but so far we do not have any accused who have been convicted.
No, we have that first. These two cases are where we have convictions.
Okay, only two. Yeah.
That I know of, yes.
Well, what appears very clearly for me is that these lynchings are a reflection of the dehumanization of the other that we are seeing now as all pervasive. And it calls to mind indeed the worst forms of racism. You mentioned the US, of course. Africa comes to mind equally vividly, and and in many cases, these lynchings are prefacing not only pogroms, but some.
Mhm.
We know in history that this is because of dehumanization that you can have mass killings on a huge magnitude. Yeah.
And that's what worried me. I mean, I see us sort of hurtling towards a genocidal situation. What gave hope suddenly was the anti-CA protest, where Hindus broke their silence and stood in solidarity. And that never happened, for instance, in Germany, when the Jews were being persecuted. So it does mean that everything is not broken in our fabric. That's the hope. Otherwise, how will one continue?
And lynchings are much less now over the last 2 years. How do you explain that, the decline of the number of lynchings?
So actually, everyone got preoccupied. They've started again. Actually, the last couple of months, we're seeing a number of incidents now. And again, they have the UP elections are coming and other elections. And the COVID situation, the handling was so terrible, with bodies floating in the Ganga. And the chief minister actually said, if anyone says we haven't got oxygen, I lock them up in jail and things like that. And 1,600 teachers are recorded of having died because they were forced into election duty. So, I mean, they have a horrible story, and they have to go to election in a few months. And the only way they think now they can, time will tell. I was talking with my friends. I mean, if they succeed in actually, again, whipping up hate through these, hate lynch attacks, then we've really lost it. And then it means that you can even, do, the COVID handling in India is is nothing short of a crime against humanity. I've written a book arguing that, because most of these deaths were avoidable deaths and caused by state actions. But they have started. I mean, they demolished a mosque recently. They're planning to demolish more mosques. An old man was caught and his beard cut again on video, and he was made to say Jai Shri Ram. A child was badly thrashed, a Muslim child, because he went into a temple trying to drink some water. So the same, the stories that the lockdown seem to have silenced have started surfacing again.
Harsh, can I ask you a question about how some of these things are also leading to expropriation of resources? So what's the political economy of this? So we've talked a lot about sort of, various other political reasons. So I was just curious as to whether you have noticed how the property of Muslims is now an open kind of, is that also featuring in your observations?
I think more in the earlier, in that third phase that I spoke about, this very large-scale displacement that happens. I mean, we have huge displacement in all of these. Muzaffarnagar, it just occurred largely in a few villages in 2 districts, and less than 100 people died. But you have something like 500,000 people who had to leave their homes and are living in these. And so what are they doing? The Muslims and Hindus would have lived together for generations, and now the only place that they now feel safe is in an existing Muslim village. But there's no land. So what they do is they're forced to buy tiny plots carved out of fields of the Muslims, in which they shamelessly profit here. And they have to sell, much nicer properties for next to nothing in the villages they've left behind. I'm sure that is very much part of the incentive to do this. But unlike, Adivasi, who sit on very valuable minerals, etc., there, of course, I think the political economy of it is very much centered around acquiring the properties. Here, I think it is a side benefit,
Right.
as far as I can see.
Thank you. So where does hope lie? I mean, I don't know, Christoph, sorry, you were going to ask perhaps another
You asked
question.
a good question. You asked a good question, Shirin. If Arsh can respond.
Yeah. See, my friends over many years have, always characterized my politics is based on an almost naive optimism and hope. I mean, that's the only way I can function. But I must confess that these years of the Karwa and the lynching, uh, for the first time, I was slipping into despair. I mean, I was saying we have to go through a very long period of, and I've studied very closely what happened in Germany and
You froze, Arsh.
Yeah.
The line is not so good now. Uh-oh. I don't know if you can hear us, or if you can, maybe you can. Yeah, you froze for a while. You were saying that you were studying what had happened in Germany.
okay, so yeah, so then and the parallels are too many, and uh, it seemed to me. I mean, I also inquired very strongly. Uh, how many times did non-Jewish German people rise up, protest, fight collectively against the persecution of Jews? And the answer is actually there is almost not a single incident. The only time they rose for about a day or two, I'm told, was against interfaith marriages, because that was when Christians were also being persecuted. And so I worried deeply if we were slipping very strongly down that path into an almost inevitable, Holocaust of by other means kind. But the anti-CA protests, the protests that we saw for those 100 days, were like a burst of brilliant light in the middle of darkness. I was, because I'm sort of seen by the Muslim community as somebody whom they trust. Uh, I was almost traveling every single day, addressing large gatherings of Muslim people, 100,000 people or more in far corners of the country. And it was exciting because you saw Hindus and Muslims together. Uh, you know, uh, they only used the national flag. The constitution was read out. The national anthem became an anthem of protest. The students had such brilliant posters. They said, like, you divide, we multiply, that kind of. And one girl had put up a poster saying two words that break my heart. And the two words were "except Muslim." And there was something very special about her wanting to say this. Uh, the Prime Minister taunted the Muslims saying, "Oh, we know who is protesting. We can make out by their clothes." And there was this young lawyer from a place called Jabalpur, a Hindu boy, young man, and it was freezing cold when the protests were happening. He suddenly turned up and he came into the protest site in Jantar Mantar, and he stripped virtually naked to his boxer shorts. And then he held a poster saying, "Prime Minister, now please recognize who I am by my clothes." So it was okay, but it was cold. It was getting colder, and we kept saying, "No, no, you made your point. Now put on some clothes." No, no, I want the Prime Minister to, to understand. That kind of solidarity is what has restored my hope, and also the idiom of protest. And this is something that I've said very often. I think if we learned anything from Mahatma Gandhi, it was that you cannot fight hate by hate, and you have. I think we've lost Christoph. Should we wait for him or?
Harshit's recording still, so you can carry on. I'm sure Christoph will jump back in.
So I was saying that uh, in Shaheen Bagh, which is one of the protest sites,
Yeah.
The BJP union minister, so he had this crowd raising slogans, "Desh ke gaddaron ko, goli maro salon ko," the traitors of this country, addressing the Muslims, shoot them all down. The women of Shaheen Bagh who were protesting said, "We want to give a return slogan," and their return slogan was to address to them, "Desh ke sab pyaron ko, oh all you lovely people of this country, phool barsao saron ko, shower them all with flowers." And I thought there was something very beautifully political in that act by working class Muslim women, saying we are not going to enter this battle on the terms that you are setting, and so on. So those are the sources of hope for me. I'm losing you again. Sorry. No.
Forgetting still to unmute myself. No, I was there, sort of in Delhi when Shaheen Bagh protests were happening, and and also the beautiful art that the students produced for it was an amazing. But
so you begin to hope again.
Yes, exactly. That's why. I mean, otherwise we'll all slip into despair, and despair is something which really is not politically wise thing to be, but it's so close.
Three students who got released on bail.
Yesterday, yeah.
Look at their faces. This young woman had lost her father because they didn't give her bail. She was smiling, shouting, etc. The young man, Asif, I just found it extraordinary that he just stepped out. He took a mask for his face and he wrote "No NRC, no CAA," and he put it on defiantly outside the jail, saying,
"I know, such bravery, such bravery."
Just saying, "I'm here."
Yeah.
I haven't been able to silence my voice, and I just wanted to go through the TV screen and hug him.
Christoph is back. So one thing that I wanted to ask you, which is really connecting what you have described and the work that you're doing in India and what we are experiencing here, sitting so far away, is, so how do you think a worldwide Islamophobia is affecting what is happening on the ground? Because I fear that spaces of impunity are being created not only at the national level, but at the international level. I mean, thankfully, we have seen the back of Trump. But I was just wondering whether where you are located, you actually feel that, or it's perhaps overreading that.
I don't think. I think especially France. Needs to reflect, on the idea of how do you live with people of difference, people who dress differently, worship differently, eat differently. Should it cause you panic? Should you demand from them that they become like you? Or do you learn to say that, no, our country is one which has space for everybody to be themselves? And at its best, the idea of India was that it gave this space. I mean, so at its best, in France, you would prohibit a girl maybe from wearing a hijab in the classroom. In India, we would defend her right to wear the hijab, regardless of whether you want to wear one or not. There is a difference, and I think that firstly that is getting blurred. So somebody like Mr. Modi is actually trying to build on a somewhat European idea of nationalism, which is based on homogenization, rather than the acceptance and respect for difference. So that is one thing that truly worries me. The second is the impunity internationally is also very utilitarian. India offers the alternative to China in terms of its economy. And virtually every transgression of Mr. Modi is sort of blinked at, uh, uh, because if you cancel his visa like they did for 12 years when he was chief minister, then you seem to have only China to go back to. So I think that there's an international impunity created by this claim to be committed to the values of democracy, of pluralism. In Western countries, most Western countries, I think, run very shallow. And also, of course, how minorities, particularly Muslims, are treated in many of these countries. I mean, I was touched most of all by the New Zealand Prime Minister, for instance, who is my favorite leader in the world at this moment. But when that young man went and videotaped while he shot dead to 50 people into mosques, I mean, the way she responded, she did actually exactly what we do in the Karma. Her first response was to go to the families who had been bereaved and to embrace them. And you could see from her face that she shared their pain. She covered her head in respect of their culture. And in learning from her example, in the next Friday, women across, police women, television anchors, ordinary women covered their heads in solidarity. The azan was sounded across TV channels and across the country. People gathered, held hands outside mosques. Those are the kinds of things. And the Imam actually said something. He said, New Zealand has taught the world what it means to love. We are broken-hearted, but we are not broken because of this love. And I wrote about it, and I said the trouble in India that I see today is that we are not broken-hearted, and that shows how broken we've become. So I think that India at its best has something to offer in the way that New Zealand offered, and recently the Canadian Prime Minister also responded in the way any leader should respond. But such few are doing so. And I think that India is sort of hurtling to follow the worst examples of that Europe has to offer us, and Trump and others. I don't know if that, sorry, that sounds a little harsh, but.
No, the European origins of Hindutva are very clear, very well known. In fact, they read the ethnic nationalist of the late 19th century, early 20th century, and emulated them. So all over the world.
Frankly appreciated, I mean, they hero worship Hitler in the writings of the RSS. So,
yeah. So everywhere in the world, two forces are fighting each other, and one of them is trying to resist the offensive of the somber one today. And this is precisely why your fight, your battle is ours. Not only because we fight for the people you defend, but because we fight for the values you defend, and we need to make them prevail in our own societies, because every society today is in a way
grappling with the same question. Yes.
Yeah.
We had a leader, I mean, I'll just very briefly tell you, there's somebody called Maulana Azad. He's not so well known outside, but he was very close to Gandhiji, and he was the one Muslim leader who opposed the idea of partition and said this is and will always remain our country. One of the questions he was asked, I mean, he's saying that if Gabriel, the angel, suddenly came on top of Qutb Minar, this was this, I mean, that time it must have been a very tall now, of course. So he says, angel Gabriel comes on top of Qutb Minar, and he says, I can give you only one of two things. One is independence, and the other is Hindu-Muslim unity. What would you choose? And his reply is, I would choose Hindu-Muslim unity, because if independence is delayed, only the Indian people will suffer. But if Hindu-Muslim unity breaks down, then all of humankind suffers, because we'll demonstrate that it's not possible to live together with difference. And it's such a lovely thought, and exactly what you're saying. I mean, I think we're fighting for a certain idea of how we live together with difference.
I suggest we end on this note, Arsh, because we have really explored a lot. I mean, thanks to you, we have covered a lot of ground. And I suggest that we have another meeting for covering in detail the Delhi riots, because it's a separate story. We will need more energy. We need to renew our energy. You are amazing because you seem to have immense energy, and we can't cope with that. And we will of course get back to you. I will stop the recording now. We will get back to you.